I've got some. Oh, yeah. But
All right. Ooh, nice. So you folks see we have the live stream camera right there on the shelf, straight in that. Yes, it is being streamed right there. Yeah, how's the sound? Good? Bring it down a little bit.
Can you hear me? Did you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? Is this working? Great, great. Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Theo Spanos-Dunphy, and I am the President and Executive Director of Global Citizen Circle. We are an independent nonprofit, but we're based here on Southern New Hampshire University campus, in fact, in this room, in this building. I want to thank first our co-sponsors for today's event, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Chandler Center, the Office of Diversity Programming, and the, now I'm blanking, the Deborah L. Coffin Women's Center. Sorry about that. Really wonderful to have such supportive colleagues here at the university. So I really appreciate that. Today, I want to briefly introduce our speakers, our discussion leaders. You can see more about them. I won't spend a lot of time on their backgrounds, their distinguished backgrounds, because you can read about them in the flyers I put on the seats. And I do want to get into the discussion. I think right now, we're at a time of, I think we can all agree, political division, and it's so important. One of the real mission behind Global Citizen Circle is to have conversations across difference. And so this discussion today goes to the heart of that. So first, let me introduce to you Alice Stewart. She is a CNN political commentator. And in the middle, we have Dean Spiliotis. Many of you know, he's the SNU civics scholar and political commentator. Many of you may listen to him regularly on Fridays on NHPR. And Latasha Brown, who is one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter Fund. So I am going to sit down now and let them talk to you. And I encourage you during the questions and answers to ask any questions, make comments. This is what we're all about. We want to have a lot of engagement from those of you who are here. So thank you.
Thank you, Theo, and welcome all. I'm thrilled to be here moderating this discussion. I'm getting a little feedback here. Drop this down. Is that okay? Okay, I was getting some feedback from behind me. I'm thrilled to be here moderating this discussion. When Theo asked me if I would sit in, I said absolutely. I think it's a great topic. I'm just going to say a couple brief words, ask one or two introductory questions to Latasha and Alice, and then we'll open it up for your discussion. And hopefully we'll all move to some better understanding of how to engage politics with civility. I often get asked by my students, I teach courses in American politics and presidential politics and campaigns and elections, and I often get asked by my students, things seem so toxic, so polarized, I can't even talk to some of my friends anymore. Is this the worst it's ever been? I'm sort of mid-late 50s-ish, and so I've been around for a little while. And I always tell them no. And in fact, in my introductory course on American politics, we go all the way back to the founding. And I can show you plenty of examples of tremendous incivility among our founders, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, those who supported the Constitution, those who opposed it, and really throughout our history. In the modern context, I lived through the Reagan administration and the Clinton administration and George W. Bush and now Obama and President Trump. In each of those administrations, I can recall times where I said to myself, geez, this is really bad. Things have really gotten toxic. People won't talk to each other. We have reached a point of incivility from which maybe there's no recovery. And those conversations are happening once again. That's not to minimize it. I do think there are some differences now as compared to maybe Ronald Reagan or even Bill Clinton in the early 90s, having to do with the role of money in politics, the impact of technology on how people engage each other. These are all things that I think have made the current situation particularly bad. And so my hope is that by the end of this hour, maybe we'll have a few ideas or ways in which we can approach the process to make it a little more enjoyable and less, frankly, off-putting. Particularly my students who come to my intro class and they're kind of interested in politics, but they haven't had a lot of experience. They find the whole incivility of the current political discourse very off-putting. So I'd like to maybe get some insight from our panelists about how they might approach that, and all of you folks as well. We have time to take plenty of questions throughout the hour. So let me begin with just an initial kind of anecdotal question for both of my guests. And Alice, I'll start with you. Just maybe recount an example of a time in which you faced a real challenge in terms of engaging another person with civility. You know, what were the circumstances? How did you deal with it? How did you approach the situation? Did you learn anything from it? And just to give us a sense of where you're at on this topic.
Great. Well, thank you for that great question, and thanks for having us here. Just so folks will know, I'm a work at CNN and now a fellow at Harvard, resident fellow at Harvard. But I'm a conservative. I've worked for 4 Republican candidates for president. I've been to New Hampshire quite a bit. So I am a conservative. And about 5 years ago, I had a radio show in Arkansas. And it was a conservative radio show. My show was followed by Glenn Beck, Mike Huckabee, Rush Limbaugh. You know, it was a conservative lineup. And I was based in Little Rock. And the focus was conversation without confrontation, and having the ability to have conversations without getting angry with each other and allowing other sides to speak. And it was from a conservative viewpoint that I was the host of the show, but I really strived to be a place where Republicans and Democrats could come and have conversations. And it was a 2-hour morning show, and I wanted to have a little lighter segment on Fridays, just something fun. I'm a big foodie. I love to cook. I love Food Network. I love food trucks, anything about food. So when y'all are done, I'm going to clear out that table over there. But there's a great food community in Little Rock, and 3 guys that are great food bloggers and really big in the food scene. I reached out to them and said, hey, on Fridays, I would love a fun segment on just food, just talking about food. And all 3 of them are very liberal. I'm aware of that, but based on just the activities that they did. But I reached out to all of them and said, hey, introduced myself and said I would love to just talk about food and your blogs. And 2 of them got back and said that would be fun. I'd love to talk about food. One of them replied, said, I know who you are. I cannot stand what you stand for. I cannot believe you would have the gall to ask me to join your show. I would never have anything to do with someone that worked for Mike Huckabee and supports the values you support. No. So I was a little taken back, and I replied, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm a big fan of your work. I really just wanted to talk about food. I think there's a lot of things to discuss that are fun to talk about, and food is sometimes a great unifier. I said, but I totally understand. I love your work. I love the fact you and your wife work together. So I will continue to read your blog and have a great day. The next day he replied and said, wow, I reached out to some people that you know that are friends of yours, and I apologize. I jumped to conclusions. I assumed that you were a right-wing wacko, which I've been accused of a lot worse. And he said, I made an assumption about you as a person that I shouldn't have. We have a lot of common friends. We have a lot of things that we share in common, and I apologize for jumping to conclusions. I'd love to join your show. the three of them came on every Friday from then on for the rest of my show, and it was probably one of my favorite segments I had every week. We talked about food. We talked about what they would do. They would go on road trips and talk about food, and we just built a great relationship as people on something we agreed on. We didn't talk about politics because we would probably erupt into a food fight. So we talked about food, and it was a great lesson for me to understand, okay, this guy doesn't, believe what I believe and align with me politically, but I still wanted to reach out and find a place where we agree and build from there. And I've enjoyed the friendship of all three of these guys, meeting their families. We've gone to events together, and that was an opportunity where we reached past the political divide and built a friendship outside of that.
Great. Latasha.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's planted by the waters. We shall not be moved. I always start, before I speak, with a song from the area I'm from. I'm originally from Selma, Alabama. And so those songs were really the sustenance of the movement there, and it's a really powerful message, I think, in that. But when I think about an example, I kind of got at least three small, these mini stories that I'll try to connect. The first is, when I'm going in spaces, and I hear it often from white colleagues, that I don't see color, right? And so on the surface, that seems like that's harmless, right? But then I'm thinking to myself, what's so bad about seeing me? What's so bad about seeing color? If you're truly okay with who I am, then why would there need to be this, why do we have to be colorblind? We don't have to be colorblind if we can appreciate and value colors. I like that roses are red and tulips can be yellow and purple and green. And I think the beauty of a bouquet is that you have that difference. And so I raise that. That's one example. And kind of lean into that. Another thing that I hear often is, even though we don't get along, I really appreciate you, right? And the challenge with that is oftentimes those that say that to me have not given me the courtesy of having a conversation with me to really know what I believe, to really have an understanding of where we believe the same and where there may be differences. But there is an assumption, because I show up in the world as a black Southern woman and that I speak and I do organizing, that in somehow I'm automatically, quote, liberal, right? And so I raise that, which leads me to kind of this third piece, which is a part of a story of an engagement that I had recently, where I was at a dinner party just this week, actually, and a really pretty well-known person asked me at the dinner party. We were having a discussion, and they were really kind of upset about what was happening politically with the impeachment. And he said to me, what, based on, he was actually trying to be very rooted and complimentary. He said, based on all the things that African Americans have gone through to be able to get the right to vote, why is it that you all don't vote in higher numbers? And so I said, well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is, given the circumstances, what has happened in America, I actually think it's pretty phenomenal that black people vote at all. And in light of the voter suppression and some of the other barriers that I witnessed, it's not really a pleasant experience in some circumstances for black people to vote, right? That even given that, I'm actually amazed that really when you look at the numbers, white voters, black voters are on par with the black voters, right? So maybe we can engage in a conversation, because I can frame this conversation with you. Let's open it up. The truth of the matter is, in this space where we have white voters who are voting on par, the same as black voters, even given the social, economic, and political advantages, why isn't that rate high? So there's a larger conversation around why is 45% of America not voting, right? And so I raise that because I think oftentimes in that space, I raise those three things because I think part of what happens in America is this idea of political civility that is at the expense of some feeling comfortable and others not, right? And so what we really need is to really be courageous enough to be truthful, right, and to be honest so that we can actually have a space where we're having these conversations that are based in love and honesty, right, and that we lean into the conflict. We don't run away from it. I don't think that America's issue is that we don't know how to get along. I think that we don't know how to be engaged in each other in conflict and where there's conflict. And so I think for me, in my example, and how I've been able to work through that is that I bring my whole self to these spaces, right? And I try to bring my thought in these spaces, but in a way that says, I fundamentally don't know what you may believe. You may believe differently from me, but I see you. And I value you just based on your humanity. And I actually trust that through our interaction, we can have a conversation that's not based in civility, but based in truth and justice and a love for humanity. And if we have that conversation, that's what I think will transform America. I think that there's one conversation that will make folks feel comfortable, but not be honest. I think there's another conversation that can be had that is rooted in truth, right, that literally can actually be transformative to both people engaged in the conversation.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to ask both of you just one follow-up question, and then we'll open it up to see what everyone wants to talk about. I mentioned at the beginning of my comments that the history of our democracy is full of moments of great incivility as well as great triumph. You can go back to the founding. But I mentioned that also now it's a little bit different. And I think a big part of that is really a function of technology and how we've increasingly started to engage each other in the public sphere rather than face-to-face as we're doing right now. And just a brief comment about the founding. The founders were very concerned about stability in the new country and about tyranny. Those who opposed the Constitution, we call them the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, their belief was that a single nation of 13 states, at the time we're basically talking the East Coast of the United States, was too large to have the national government fairly represent everyone's interests, particularly Southern interests, rural interests, agrarian interests. Those folks who opposed the Constitution believed that they were going to be captive to the interest of the big urban northern cities, the economic interests of Boston, New York, Philadelphia. And what is so interesting to me is in Federalist 10, the papers that defend the ratification of the Constitution, James Madison says the exact opposite. He says, no, no, no. The larger the country, the better. Because the larger the country, the more likely we are to have a plurality of interests and a diversity of interests. The more different kinds of people there are spread out over a great country, the harder it's going to be for like-minded individuals to recognize each other and carry out their plans of oppression. So Madison literally had a geographical solution to polarization and the potential for tyranny in politics. And I hear a lot of people now using words like authoritarianism and chaos and tyranny, et cetera. So that has a little bit of that flavor. And the problem with Madison's argument, though, is today we now have the technology so that like-minded individuals can find each other anywhere in the world. So you have Americans being radicalized by stuff that's coming from overseas. You have people who are interested in a particular issue, whether it's guns or right to life, pro-choice issues, whatever your issue is, the environment, climate change, you can now find like-minded individuals anywhere through the internet. So Madison's argument that in a large country, this diversity is going to prevent people from finding each other and engaging in bad behavior doesn't really hold anymore. So what I wanted to ask both of you is about the internet and the role of digital media. I view it as a double-edged sword. I think there are some really good things about it. There are some real bad things about it, but it does undercut that fundamental notion that a pluralistic society, that people, by virtue of the diversity and pluralistic nature of that society, are more likely to engage each other in a way that's going to forestall any kind of tyranny or chaos. So let me turn to you, Alice. Your general thoughts on how the internet, and we've all been doing this long enough that we remember what it was like before, when we had these intense political discussions before you could get on Facebook or Twitter or any other texting, what have you. kind of what you see as the pros and cons. What do you like about the way we engage digitally now, and what do you dislike?
It is a double-edged sword. It's got tremendous benefits, but it's also been used for tremendous negative activity. And I always look at it from the standpoint, from a campaign standpoint, we often relied on the internet, social media, emails, Twitter, Facebook, all these different avenues with the internet to get our message out there. And whether we wanted to push a campaign message, whether we wanted to respond to an attack, whether we wanted to get the word out that we're going to be at SNHU this weekend, Friday at 5, please come join us. It's a great avenue for pushing your message out there and, as you say, bringing in like-minded people. Oftentimes we would use it to put out, if we were going to talk about live free or die policies, things that support what folks here in New Hampshire stand behind, and really the motto here. Or if we were going to South Carolina, we would do the God and Guns kind of tour where we talk about freedom of religion and Second Amendment rights. New Hampshire, we would use it to push ethanol policies or agriculture or the life issue. And it's great from that standpoint, from a campaign standpoint of pushing out that. The negative aspect is the way that it is used to push out false and negative information. And everyone can agree that when people put out false and critical attacks, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can put its pants on. So when someone puts out a negative attack, or if the National Enquirer writes an absurd story that your boss's father was involved in the assassination of JFK, which happened to Ted Cruz's father,
Right.
That's one of those things, and it didn't help that the current president of the United States promoted that agenda when he was on the campaign trail. It's one of those situations where it picks up steam and energy on the internet, and by the time we're catching up to it, you're playing defense, and the last place you want to be on a campaign is on defense. So the difficult part of the internet is coming to terms with the many benefits that it provides campaigns. Certainly it's a lot cheaper than going out or sending out mail pieces, or as Theo had said, when she was in campaign, she would send out or do leaflets. Probably not a lot of you deal with leaflets on campaigns anymore because you do the internet. If you want to get the message out, you send an email, you post it on social media, and you do it that way. It's a lot cheaper, it's a lot faster, it's a lot more efficient, but at the same time, it can be really damning if you're trying to push out some negative information about someone. And oftentimes that can be done anonymously. There's no fact checking. And I love the media. I think the media has an important role to play in being a check and balance for our elected officials, but oftentimes they will get a story and run with it without the proper due diligence of fact-checking things. And by the time it's deemed inaccurate, it's already gotten out there. And as I say, it's difficult sometimes to put the toothpaste back in the tube, and if negative information has been used out there with regard to internet and technology, it's very difficult to walk that back. So it's got a lot of positive aspects, but then again, it can be harmful.
Yeah,
I agree totally with Alice's analysis. I think that's exactly what we're dealing with. Just to take a step back, though, I think I question if the problem is the internet. And what I mean by that is I think the internet has its own issue because the pace in which it delivers the message and the scale in which it reaches, right? But more than that, I think we also need to think about, kind of the context where people are rooted in, and if we're honest, even in America, if we're honest, that I think we have 45% of people don't vote. We have a very unengaged electorate, and we have an uninformed electorate. Sometimes you all may have watched the late night shows, and they'll go ask who's the president or the vice president. The majority of Americans don't have a clue. And so I think part of what makes the internet effective is that there's a particular vulnerability based on a lack of education, political education, and a lack of people paying attention. And so they become vulnerable to these lies and this information. I think that there's always, I mean, just for someone in the South that has worked on many, many campaigns where we literally would see in the black community, we would see flyers that would say, make sure you go vote on Wednesday. The elections were never on Wednesday, they were on Tuesday, right? I have, on my phone right now, I have copies of recordings that when Doug Jones ran Doug Jones and Roy Moore race in 2017, there were phone calls, robocalls that were saying it was the Frederick Douglass Association and that do not vote for Doug Jones because he was bad for black people, and just this amazing amount of just lies, right? And so I think that there's always been that element. I think the space, the pace of it, and the scale. But I think what it does is I think when we're faced with that, then the question is, how do we address it? And I think that's why it's really important for us to really think about how critically important it is for us to really think about civic education, but not just how government works, but for us to have these conversations where we're leaning into thinking about what we're really pushing people on. What do you really fundamentally believe? Because I do think that there's a part right now that what has all of us hostage is we're putting everything in a partisan piece. And we're treating politics and we're treating America like a football season. It's your team and it's my team, right? And so ultimately, how can we move forward with that? I think it's important for us, those of us that have these spaces, to have conversations like this, to really push the envelope where we're actually helping people to think deeper and to think more radical around what is it that you believe. Or do you believe that because you heard it on Fox or CNN, or do you fundamentally believe that because it aligns with your values? And we're seeing it play out. I think we're seeing it play out in the public sphere now. That is not a matter of you're saying, oh, there's these false equivalencies, right? So this person is a conservative. That means this person is a liberal, right? No, sometimes it's not about the right or the left. It's just about right or wrong. And some people, there are some things that I believe that I attach it with some people, right, spaces. Some I'm not limited to a particular political party, nor am I limited to a particular set of beliefs, but I'm ultimately like trying to figure out what the truth is that's going to advance humanity. And I think that we're not having enough of those conversations. And so when we have those conversations and really people are being grounded differently, I think it has the ability to disrupt the impact that the internet is having in terms of spreading misinformation, because I think that information is grabbing root in light of a gap of people, a knowledge gap that people have.
Yeah, these are great comments, and I agree with what Alice said about, and also Latasha, about the sheer speed and volume at which information is now pushed out into the world. It really is like the proverbial fire hose, and students often come to me and say, I don't know what to believe anymore, I don't know who to read, etc. And when I go out in the community and talk to older groups of adults, same thing. We're overwhelmed, there's too much information, we don't know what to believe. The one thing I would add in there, for me, what I find most interesting about internet technology and the ability of like-minded individuals to now be able to find each other in every corner of the globe, which, as I said, really undercuts Madison's rationale, is the impact that it has on how we divide ourselves up and self-segregate into human communities. It really is the case that it's human nature. We all know there's plenty of research in political psychology that people like to filter out cognitive dissonance. They filter out things that don't agree with their preconceived notions. If you're in a physical space or a community that is diverse and people disagree with you, it's a lot easier to retreat to your phone, to find your particular group of people in your particular silo. We're now even seeing people segregate geographically when they move into communities. So the issue of the whole issue of information and the truthfulness of information and the speed with which we're hit with misinformation, I think is a big problem. But I think that the structural problem here is the self-segregation by like-minded individuals into groups that really allow you to kind of just sort of self-reinforce and self-segregate, and makes it really, if you don't get a lot of practice engaging people that you disagree with, it's easier just to say, no, I'll try watching MSNBC. No, I can't take it. I'm going to go back to Fox. Or I'm watching Fox, go back to MSNBC. That's a simple example, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Right. So for me, those are the two. It's the information flow, but it's also the impact, I think, on human communities. And I wish I had the opportunity to explain the internet to Madison and see what he says about like-minded individuals not finding each other. Okay, let's open it up to questions. We have a handheld mic, I believe. If you could stand, tell us who you are and where you're from. We'll see what you want to talk about. Yeah, over there.
Thanks for coming to campus. Is this on?
Yeah,
Good? Okay,
yep, you
great.
sound good.
That's a beautiful campus.
You know where I'm getting stuck right now is tone, right? I just shut down because all the work I do all day long in raising a family and working with colleagues, building neighbors, is finding ways to engage and create safe spaces to have ideas exchanged. And that's the part where I feel like so much of what's out there is shaped by tone. You know, I turn off whatever station it is when they start yelling over each other. You know, it just becomes this loud noise. And I'm just wondering how do we get people to even get to a place that it's safe to engage? I mean, you see things with hearings and people denigrating people and name calling and all of that, which would never be acceptable in this workplace. You'd have people lined up outside the HR office. And so I'm wondering what you think about some of that commentary and how that's shaping our attempts to have dialogue.
Sure. And I think I'll start with Alice. I just want to add to that. Years ago, when I first started using email, I learned very early on, never email when you're angry. Now I've learned never tweet when you're angry. I will start to type something, and then I'll just put the phone down and walk away, and I'm always glad I did. Yeah, Alice?
And always never tweet after you've had a glass of wine.
That too.
That's
That can
another
get you into trouble
good
too.
rule of thumb.
Yep.
I think, look, Latasha's on many panels on various networks. I'm on CNN. I also do some ABC. And there's sometimes a school of thought on different shows that they want either panelists that some panelists provide the steak, some provide the sizzle. And they like to have a couple of folks that provide sizzle and go back and forth. It makes for good television, and it's interesting, and some viewers like that. I prefer to be more of a steak person and come there with my thoughts and my ideas and find where we have common ground and make my case on my argument. And I don't have to feel as though I need to get personal with the other side. I try to stick to policy. I think that's a important way to be. And that's how you go about, I think, having successful conversations. And with regard to when you watch the different networks, some people will tend to go towards Fox, obviously more conservative, or you go to different networks. You generally have an idea of where a show is coming from, the slant it's coming from. I think there are many places where you can go. I tend to wake up and read various news outlets, but Real Clear Politics is a great place to go where it has all the news of the day. It has articles from a Republican or a conservative-leaning journalist, a Democrat, and you can go down the list of the stories, and it kind of gives both sides. And I sometimes watch my news programs that way too, because if it gets too hostile on one show, sometimes I'll flip over just to get a change of pace in the ideology, but also a change of pace in the tone, because it is sometimes it's a little bit much, and that you just have to switch to another network or just go to the Food Channel and watch how you make tacos.
Latasha, your thoughts on tone?
So recently, I'll share just a quick story. Recently, there's a young man at Harvard who is a Republican, a conservative Republican from Alabama, which is a state. And Alabama has a special partisan kind of perspective, a very, very partisan state. And this young man and I had engaged in a conversation around a particular election that's coming up. And so I actually had some thoughts around it to share with him. And he wound up going to campaign, wound up quitting the campaign, and wanted to meet with me, wanted to come to my office. He came to my office last week, and he sat down, and he actually thanked me. He was thanking me for this conversation, said that it had opened him up to think about some things, and that he wanted advice from me of how he could help build the Republican Party in the state of Alabama. And so I raised that because I'm who I am in all of those spaces, right? And so, but my engagement, even my tone in engaging him, was that I can be very passionate about the pieces that I feel. That's how I communicate. Don't put judgment on how I communicate, right? But I can still honor you in that process. And so because of that space in honoring him and him recognizing that I honored him, even though I was very passionate about what I shared, it gave space for something that was unexpected to both of us to develop in that process. And so what I offer is, I think that around tone two things. One, I think we also have to build a muscle. That we have to build a muscle that if we really want to engage in a conversation, because sometimes we really don't want to. We don't want to engage in conversation. We don't really want the answer, right? We would rather just. You just need to believe what I believe, right? And so I think we need to build a muscle around so that we can actually hear people and hear things that are different to even shift and stretch us in our belief, right? And I think we should learn what's behind a tone. Sometimes the tone is not about you, right? Sometimes the tone is because that person is passionate, right? Sometimes it's that tone is that's the way that person communicates. And so over the years, for me around tone, I give grace and space to really hear with others. If I think that you're coming from a place of your authentic self, right, and that is not, and I don't feel attacked, right, and I just feel like you're just in your space right now. You pissed off right now because this issue is bothering you, right? That I give you space and grace for that. So for me, I think that we've got to develop that muscle, because if you've ever been in a coffee shop in Paris, you would think they're about to fight, right? But they are able to, there's enough trust and there's enough space and grace that they're able to engage in these very intense conversations, highly opinionated conversations. If you've ever been to the continent of Africa and Nigeria, right, and you like just sit there and listen, people are going at it, right? And at the end of the day, 5 minutes later, they're sitting down and they're eating food together. I think there has been a particular framework that has been to protect the feelings, the beliefs of a few that we've adopted, that we have not developed the muscle to really be able to engage in conflict. And I think tone, I mean, part of it, like Alice said, I think there is a particular tone that is for entertainment, right? That the shows set up a particular dynamic, right? Because it's really for entertainment, not true engagement. But I do think that there is a space that if we're talking about civil discourse and we really want to lean into that, then we're also going to have to stretch ourselves to really be able to give grace and space to others that may communicate very differently.
And I think also along those lines, sometimes what I often say to myself when I'm having conversations with people, and I generally know a lot of the folks I'm generally on with, but I finally realize, look, I'm not as concerned with what your true north is, but that you have one. And I respect the fact that your true north might be a little different from mine, and you're not one of those people that's just sticking your finger in the wind and is going to go, I'm going to believe this today and this today and this today, but you have a true north, and I respect that. And that's where we need to build, like, let's find common ground on what we do agree on and move from there. But we have to understand everyone has a different true north, and we should just show respect for that.
Yeah, and Natasha, your point is well taken. I think people often mistakenly equate being passionate with being incivil and being detached and reasonable as being civil. And there also are differences across communities and nationalities. And I come from a Mediterranean family, and everybody talks with their hands and yells, and then, like you said, we all sit down and eat dinner. And, but for other people, they're like kind of surprised by it. Right. So you have to keep all of that diversity in mind. Other questions? Got some hands? Oh, great. Got some hands up here.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Chris Halo. I'm a professor here on campus. Thanks so much for coming. Really glad to see you. So you don't have to convince me of the importance of civility in conversations for the purposes of us being able to function as a society, like actually move policy conversations forward. I mean, I guess as a philosopher, I'm happy to have conversations with people all the time. It's kind of what I do. But I guess I would say that I'm not as convinced any longer that other people see the inherent value of it, and there's a sense in which I guess that's kind of what concerns me. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. And I guess where I'm coming from is something like this. I think all of us would kind of recognize that if it's the case that I recognize the fact that you have a perspective that's different than mine, and we realize that we have to cohabitate, we have to work in a society together, there's a sense in which at the end of the day we're going to realize we both have a stake in each other's success, right, in our ability to conduct ourselves. But there might actually be examples where that's not as obvious, right? And I guess what I kind of had in mind is, I mean, this is a stock example that I don't love, but I mean, I'll just pick out an example for me. I think it's the case that very little good can come from me engaging with a white nationalist. Like, I don't think much good is going to come from that. I think it's the case that they just fundamentally see the world in a way that's very, very different than mine. And so I'm not sure if incivility is the response, but I definitely feel like there's a way in which engagement is no longer productive or useful. And the thing that kind of concerns me, though, is the reason why I guess I set that mark where I do is it's just the case that they're not going to grant certain people that I think do have rights, the right to live their lives in the way that I imagine they should. But they could probably look around at me and look at other people that I live in a society with and I think are legitimate, and they would deny them that same right. And so I don't know, I'm just wondering, because I mean, again, like I think you're absolutely right, your point about how it's the case that we kind of have these bubbles, and it's the case that we have this technology that enables people to enter into the discussions and become more prominent than they naturally otherwise would be. And it just strikes me as a very, very sticky situation if civility itself is not seen as a value, and if we're living in a society where the means by which we can interact with each other don't really prioritize that. Because again, like, I mean, I love CNN, I love watching Fox News, I love taking these things in, but at the same time I recognize that, and I think we have to admit that there's sometimes not civility there, that we otherize people from both sides, right? I mean, and even mentioning things like, you know, the media is misleading people or things like that, like, well, no, it's specific members of it as opposed to like the entire category, because this is really disparate. Sorry, that's kind of rambling, but that's where I'm coming
So
from.
your thoughts, let's hear from both of you.
So a couple of thoughts. So one, I really want to unpack, we don't have time, but I really want to unpack the notion of what is civility. I and my community have a particular relationship of being civility in this country, right? Civility meant that at one point Martin Luther King was considered a communist, right? Civility meant that some people who just asked a question were actually murdered, right? And so I raise that because I think sometimes we romanticize those things without unpacking what is the opportunity that's being presented to us now, right? And so I don't know, you know, people say, well, we can go back to the good old days. When would that be? Would that be 80s and the Reagan years, which there were major economic issues for my community, and there are people who benefited greatly, enriched themselves, right? Is that the 60s? You know, what period is that? My belief is not to move forward, go backwards, is to move forward. I raise that because I think that we need to unpack what this whole notion of civility really means, right? How do we actually evolve and have a conversation that is based in mutual respect, but allows for space for difference in thoughts? I'm not so sure that there was, even in the context of this country, this moment that we actually had explored the heights of that, right? Being that the majority of the time in the country, including with the framers in the Constitution, there was a sizable part of the population who were not even allowed to participate in that, right? So I just want to raise that. Secondly, in this context around, you know, I think sometimes we think that you need everybody to believe a certain thing. I think we put this notion of, if I could just talk to this person, you know, it's going to change everything. It's kind of like those gatherings of, if we just bring 2 white people together and 2 black people in the South, we're going to work it out, right? And what it does is it ignores that there's a structural problem that needs to be addressed, right? That really shapes the political ideology and shapes how people see themselves, right? That we've got to function and actually address that those conversations may actually help those 4 people, right? But do they help the larger kind of narrative? Given that, the reason why I say that, given that, I think that even in the case like the example that you raised, perhaps that conversation wouldn't go anywhere, right? But perhaps it will, because you're a white male. Perhaps they can hear you in a way that they won't hear me, right? Perhaps you have space to have that conversation. I don't know if you do or not. I'm raising it, right? And I raise this because I think there's a level of privilege and comfort that we also got to unpack. Because oftentimes I've been forced, for my very survival, to have conversations with people that I didn't want to have conversations with, right? Because I had to believe that there's something in my authenticity, that's something in my belief, if nothing else but just pierce where it created an opening, that right there may be enough. And so I raise that part of what I think that we're doing is we look at conversations, we're looking at conversations of, can I evangelize to you? instead of can I plant a seed? So perhaps I might not evangelize to you. Perhaps I might not transform you. But perhaps I might plant a seed for you to think or to see something that you've not seen otherwise. And I offer that in itself could possibly transform them or not, right? But in the case that it could be, right, how much better we would be. And so in that, I just offer that in these spaces when we're talking about conversations, I think it's important for us to see the power of conversations, but also don't over-romanticize and overvalue them in a way that we're missionaries now. Like everything I say, I got to turn you and be a part of it.
And I do think you're making a good point there that the issue of civility in the conversation itself is one thing, but when you take a step back and look at the larger context that everybody brings to that conversation, it's a much more complex set of challenges. In your case, mentioning sort of the priors of white nationalism. So it's a challenge, no doubt. And Alice, I'm interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think going into a conversation with someone of that background, you have to go with the mindset of this isn't an opportunity where I feel I'm going to change this person's mind, but it's going to broaden my understanding of why he thinks that. And in turn, I'm able to share my views and it would broaden his understanding. I think while today in this society, we put such a focus on diversity, whether we're talking about in the workplace or in institutes of higher education or in various places, we look at diversity, but we don't look at diversity of ideology. And I think it's really important for us to broaden our understanding of other thoughts, not necessarily with that person, but the more we can engage with people that have a different ideology, we can broaden their understanding of where we come from, and to Latasha's point, hopefully plant a seed where they will realize that they may need to rethink this. A quick story, years ago I was a journalist in Arkansas, and in North Arkansas was the compound for the Klan, Ku Klux Klan, and it was a very secure place, and I somehow got an interview with the Grand Wizard of the Klan, and I went up there in this windy road, cameras everywhere, kind of fearful, and I just, because they had been doing a lot of protests, and we sat down, had a long interview, and he gave me his whole spiel, and I said, how in the world can you support, as a pastor, as a man of faith, black and white people, why they can't be married? So where in the Bible does it say that? How can this be the foundation of what you think and believe? It does not say that in the Bible. Where do you get that? He said it is in the Bible, in the commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery, which in his mind, mixing of two different things. And I said, that's not what that's about. He said, that is absolutely what it's about. I fundamentally, unequivocally disagreed with that, but that's the foundation of his belief and his understanding. It doesn't make sense to me, but I had a better understanding of why they felt that way. I obviously was never going to change his mind, but it was helpful for me to see why they think that way. I don't agree with it, but he actually did feel that way, and that's the message they're sending. But for me, I walked away with, okay, there's some foundation for this lunacy. So sometimes it's helpful to get an understanding of where they're coming from, even though it makes absolutely, positively no sense.
Other questions? Where's the mic? Oh, okay.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth. I work here on campus. You, Dean, you opened talking about the Founding Fathers and how you wish you could explain the internet to James Madison. I wish I could explain cable news and the 24-hour news cycle, because I also think that that's something that our Founding Fathers probably could not have imagined. And I really think, right, you have both talked about sort of this blending of news and entertainment, of needing to put two people who disagree so that there is anger and conflict and division in order to get ratings and advertisement dollars. And I wonder if you could talk about, right, we talked a little bit about the internet and the role that the internet has. What about cable news, which it sounds like, right, at least Alice, but I don't know, Tasha, if you're often on cable news, but right, that you're sort of part of the system that might also be leading to some of our divisions.
That's a great question, and Alice, I'm going to start with you because you have a connection with CNN. And I don't mean to pick on Chris Cuomo, but he has this thing on his show called The Great Debate at 9 p.m., and it's very predictable. It's going to be this sort of one person way over here and one person way over there, and I usually come away just kind of frustrated with the whole conversation. Not always, but a lot of times it seems a little too, as you were saying, intentional to generate this kind of infotainment. And so I'm wondering, your thoughts in general, but how you might make that, quote, great debate a more useful conversation.
Well, you have to realize the news business is a business, and they
That is
operate
true.
from the principle of supply and demand. And if the people are demanding or tuning in to this type of programming, they will continue to supply it ad nauseum. And they watch ratings. They see every quarter hour how the ratings go. And if a heated panel, the great debate, gets a lot of attention and there's a lot of people tuning in, they will
They'll do it
sometimes
again.
make it
Oh,
make
go
it
longer.
longer.
Oh,
they'll,
interesting.
they'll keep it going.
interesting.
Or if it's a topic that resonates with people or a person that resonates with people, they will continue to bring that on. So I see what you're saying in terms of why do news outlets continue to do this? Because people tune in and people will watch it. And I think a more civil conversation is a better way to get both sides out there. And what Chris's objective in the great debate is here's the topic of the day. Here's two very passionate people talking about an important topic of the day. And there's a lot of sizzle in there.
There is.
But they would not do this if people weren't watching. And I know that there's a lot of people that it's not pleasant to watch or you'd rather watch something else, but there are a lot of people that do. And if I can give a nice plug for my friend Latasha, she will be on MSNBC today at 4:30, so make sure you watch.
Great. Natasha, your thoughts?
Can I ask a quick
Oh,
follow-up question?
okay, and then we'll go to Latasha.
I understand. I'm not confused about why it happens. I understand that people tune in, and then people tune in. We get money from that, right? Capitalism. I get that. But it seems like we made a choice as a country to move away from news as not entertainment, news as delivering factual information to news as entertainment. And I guess that is what is troubling to me. I get it, right? That it's about making money and that people tune into that because they like it, and then you can share it online. You get lots of yeah. But it doesn't feel ethical. It doesn't feel responsible to me. And so I guess that's more my question.
Yeah, and I'll just to add, and then I'll turn to you, Latasha. It's a very good point. Really, I started talking about Madison and the internet, but the precursor to digital media really is the cable news. And starting in the late 70s, early 80s, when you started to get penetration of households with cable in their wiring neighborhoods. And I grew up in the 70s, and we had black and white TV that got 3 networks, public television, and 1 or 2 syndicated channels that showed Abbott and Costello and Popeye and stuff, reruns, things like that. So everybody was watching the same stuff. So the basis of the discussion, the factual basis, to the extent you want to call it that, was a lot more similar. Now you were certainly beholden to whatever the 3 networks decided were the stories of the day, but at least we were all kind of talking about the same raw material, and I think that's changed. So your thoughts on cable news?
Just quickly, I think your analysis is right. I just offer that if it is in fact this is being driven by business, the fundamental backers of business are consumers. And so I offer that if that is the case, and I think, for me, when I go on, and this has been frustrating, when I've gone on shows with some of my colleagues, and particularly some of my Republican colleagues, who fundamentally don't believe in Trump, but will literally get on TV and support Trump. And I have side conversations with them, and I'm like, well, why are you saying that? That's not what you believe. I try to, in those spaces, God forbid that I don't want to be in those spaces if I can't literally bring a particular truth and a perspective, right? And so I think that also that there are people who take advantage and are very opportunistic in those spaces. And so I would just say as a consumer, right, I think, it's kind of the same thing in terms of politics, that it's not that many people that's making a ruckus about it. I think that a committed, a few could actually have an impact on some level around that, and that to really be able to pull the needle back. I don't know what the future is going to be, but I think that there's a way that because we've got Twitter and Facebook and those places, folks who are on TV, that and you can see when people are being real and people are being performative, right? Oftentimes those folks, you have access to them. You can find them on Twitter. You can organize around that. I think ultimately all that's going to get this right is really people lining up and really standing in our power of holding those spaces accountable.
Other questions?
Just to follow up on that, my name's Nicole, by the way.
Nicole?
I think to go back to the framers, they were definitely holding up, white, male, propertied hegemony.
Absolutely.
Like anything that
They were the only ones who could vote.
that was the minority voice,
Yeah.
against that would be,
Sure.
Madison would probably call wanting to oppress us, right? Given, and maybe this is an assumption I shouldn't assume, but given that journalism and facts on the one side and education on the other are essential to maintaining a healthy democracy, I don't think it's sufficient or fair to say, well, you need to shop smarter as a consumer because this is capitalism and journalism is a business. Education is a business. I don't accept that. And I think that civility comes back too. It's like, well, it's on you to convince that person you're talking to. Even if you're the oppressed body, it's
Right.
your job to speak to power in that situation and to stand up. And I feel like it's exhausting.
Right.
And I feel like it's not fair. And it's not sufficient to say, well, just don't watch that because I don't, but my neighbors do.
Absolutely.
And in this country, majority wins. So if the majority of people are watching what is dictated by the market, to me, is that really what democracy is? And I don't think the majority of Americans think it is. And so I think we have to make a concerted effort to provide a real education to Americans so that they can't be radicalized by people in the Middle East who are on the internet. Like, if we're educated, that shouldn't be happening. So I feel like we have to go a step further than saying, well, that's on each individual to be civil in dialogue, to be educated. And I feel like if we have a system, we should make sure that system functions.
Yeah.
And how can we start to talk about that also, not just, well, you need to be civil.
Yeah, I will say just briefly, and then we'll turn to the panelists. I've been teaching for about 25 years, and I've been involved in a number of civic education initiatives and attempts to get students and community more civically engaged and talking in the way that you're suggesting. It's very challenging because even agreeing on what civic education is and should look like is a politically charged issue. Talk to any high school in New Hampshire about trying to put a civic education component into their curriculum. Parents don't agree on what civic education is, and teachers don't agree. And so I think you laid out quite nicely what the challenge is. I've been at it for 25 years. It's tough. There's just not a lot of agreement on how we would move forward to kind of realize the type of environment that you're suggesting. But I'm interested to hear what you both think.
Go ahead. I think in terms of kind of going back to, there's a couple issues that you raised. In defense of various news outlets, they put out a lot of news. And every morning the news outlets have their meetings. Here's what we're going to cover. But there are certain aspects where they have panels where it is more partisan and they're back and forth and debating the issues. And that's part of the overall news programming. But if you watch any of the networks, Fox, CNN, all of them, MSNBC, they're covering news for the most part, the bulk of their programming. But they do have some that are a little bit more entertainment focused, but it is centered around the news of the day. And I think that's a really important point to make. And all the journalists, all of them, they strive to be factually accurate. They strive to provide information that is not based on alternative facts, and they push back and they fact check. That's why we have the Washington Post fact checker. But they all do fact check. So individual journalists strive to be factually and accurate, and I think that's an important point to take away from the news outlet. But in terms of education and civics in education, I think you're going to have a lot of. It would be difficult to do that because parents, and I don't have children, but my sister has 4 kids in college, and there were times where certain assignments would come back that might have been a little different than their ideology, and they didn't feel that was the place of the school because it wasn't a balance of different civics topics. So I think in order to get to that point, there's going to be there would be a lot of conversations that would need to be had in terms of how they go about teaching this in school, because there's so much difference of opinion.
Yeah, I've been involved in many of those over the years. They're very challenging to get through. Latasha.
Just 3 quick points. The first point is we've got to do the work. The problem is we want an easy solution to something that is fundamentally and structurally difficult. And that we've got to do the work. We've literally got to have conversations that are rooted in honesty and really push people around their thinking. Which leads to my second point. My second point is this notion of democracy. So we have collapsed American exceptionalism and democracy in a way that we think that everybody believes in democracy. I don't know if I fundamentally believe that most folks in this country believe in democracy. I don't know if fundamentally most people even know what it is, to be honest. There's a conceptual kind of idealism around it, but so why are we accepting the Electoral College if we believe in democracy, right? Why are we accepting? So there's some elements that we're not being truthful and honest about that I do think if we open up that space, we can really have some genuine conversations about the elephants in the room. And then the third piece is, I am one of the ones, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I love studying elements around the Constitution, but I'm also one of the people that I don't believe that the framers, who were very limited and very elitist, right, thought of every thought that could be thunk about democracy. And as long as we think that all things go back to them and what and their belief around it, we will be limited by their lack of vision. And so I would hope that in this space that we find ourselves, that we would build upon what is already here around this conversation of democracy. But I also think it's an opportunity for that conversation to actually evolve, that as the world evolves, I think we should as well.
Well, and if you look at the Federalist Papers, Madison and especially Hamilton, in I think 9, Hamilton, dismissive of some aspects of pure democracy. They were really focused on a federal republic. And so they saw downsides to basically getting everybody together and having one big conversation. It didn't really represent their interests. So that's a very interesting point. Do we have time for one more? Okay. You've had your hand up for the entire time, so we'll let you take us out.
I'm just curious about like getting past your own opinions. Like for me, I'm very passionate about certain things, and I know I feel like I can't talk to other people because I'm so, I guess, disgusted with how they feel about certain other topics that I might feel passionate about. So getting past your own opinion to be able to be in that space of hearing out somebody else.
So I'll just say the tool that I use. One, I don't think that I have to engage in conversations that are harmful for me. That's just me. I don't believe that I have to, right? I do believe that in their conversations, I differ with people all the time. I differ with my partner, right, who I'm in this organization with, right? I differ from people that I do work with, right? What I have found as a tool for me is that I seek where there's alignment. Alignment is distinctively different from agreement, right? And so alignment to me is, are there some fundamental things around that we can actually align around? Your approach to it may be different than mine, but there's some alignment around it, right? I think when we start getting an agreement, that's where the problem is, because what it says is my belief supersedes whatever you believe. So unless you believe what I believe, I'm going to dismiss you. But if I know that we're on the basis that we're talking about humanity and that your idea that you love humanity, even though what you think is a solution may be distinctively different from me, if I know that there's enough alignment for us to really be engaged in a conversation, that's kind of like the box in which I am. Outside of that, if you are someone who wants to destroy humanity, right, I don't know if I necessarily have to create space. I think there's enough space over here that I don't understand these other people that are in alignment and have different pieces with me, that I need to be in conversation with them, right? And so that's where I choose to put my time and my energy and the conversations that I have.
One thing that comes to mind at Harvard, reading a lot of stuff of JFK, and one of his quotes was about civility in politics, and he encouraged people, and these were people during his time, was to approach civility in politics from a point of strength, not weakness. And he says oftentimes people think if you're conceding to the other side, it's weakness. But you don't have to look at it as conceding when you agree with someone, and have conversations about politics from a point of strength. And I firmly believe what I believe, you firmly believe what you believe, and we can agree to disagree. And as Latasha says, there's points of alignment. there is common ground on a lot of what we have before us. And we can realize there's much more that unites us than divides us, as not just in politics, but in this world. And if we focus on where we agree rather than disagree, we'll make a much more progress on these conversations.
Yeah, I will just say in closing, it's like a muscle. You have to exercise it and practice. My imperative as a teacher is to make my students feel comfortable expressing their views in an open classroom. Sometimes that's a challenge, but it gets easier year after year. You may also decide to kind of compartmentalize a little bit. So you may be passionate and emotional with your spouse or a family member, but maybe in a different context, you're a little bit more a little more dispassionate. It is doable. It's challenging. The longer I do this, the more I see that politics, there's so much passion and emotion and adrenaline, and the name of the game is to figure out how to use that in constructive ways. And it's a challenge. And I think here, just to kind of sum up, we've talked about the nature of the conversations and how you might approach the conversations, but I think both our panelists and Latasha in particular raised some important points about the broader context, what people bring to the table when they have conversations, and the importance of kind of understanding where other people are coming from. And it is easy to kind of scapegoat the media. I spent a lot of time dealing with journalists, and the vast majority of journalists, it is a business. They're trying to do their best, and it's a challenge. But I think we gave you a lot of food for thought. And I really enjoyed it, and this was a terrific conversation. Thanks to both.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry. Thank everybody for coming. I hope that we can all take away some of the wisdom that we've heard today about having conversations, because we're all going to go to our families and friends for Thanksgiving meals, and oftentimes we don't want to have these conversations that may have a little bit of conflict associated with them. So I hope that from what we've heard and learned today, that we can use some of that as we go forward. Thanks for coming. Oh, and yes, and let me just mention one thing. Youth New Hampshire. Okay. She has, over here, has some pledge cards if you are wanting to be reminded to vote or pledge to vote. Yeah.
Hey, everyone. My name's Josie. I work with a group called New Hampshire Youth Movement. We're an organization started by young people trying to get other young people out to vote. And one noticing I have right now is that there's not a lot of young people, not a lot of students out here today. And in a lot of conversations I've had with students, they are just really not super informed about what's going on right now. And I know, you work for CNN, but a lot of young people don't watch cable news. A lot of us don't respond to door knocking or phone banking, which are the traditional tactics for getting out the vote. My ask of all of you professors is I would love to get all your emails and come into some of your classes. That has been the most helpful way we have gotten students to pledge to vote, is just by taking 2 minutes before the classes that they're already supposed to go to and talking to them. But otherwise, it's been really hard for us to get young people in particular to pledge to vote, because none of the systems we have for getting out the vote are really geared towards young people. So our organization, like she said, New Hampshire Youth Movement, we are getting students to pledge to vote so we can give them the sufficient amounts of taps they need to get out and vote. Studies show young people need 7 to 10 reminders to actually get out and vote. They need a plan to vote. They really need, help in the process. So by doing this, it gets students looped into our phone banking, text banking tactics, and we'll make sure they know when to vote, where to go, all the things. So I see you're a young person. I would love to know if you would pledge to vote with us. But otherwise, if I could come into your classes at some point over the next couple of weeks, I would love to set up a time to do that. So thank you all for your time. Please talk to me if that's something you'd be down with. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think